Hello watch enthusiasts. Now today I'd like to talk about what I think are some great options for historical watches which are priced at under £1,000. Now this is an interesting category because I only once touched on this once before, and that was talking about the historical watches under £300. However, following various questions from people, I think it's suitable to produce one for the £1,000 price mark. And in this video I will cover watches that are less than £1,000 too, but it's very much up to that point of £1,000. So really this video covers everything from about £500 to that £1,000 mark. And I think there are a lot of very interesting watches from all different categories, from military watches to dive watches to dress watches in this category, which certainly do lend to a modern yet historical aesthetic, which certainly does show the history and the longevity of these respective brands. The first watch on this list is of course the Marathon Diver, and this watch comes in two versions really under the £1,000 price tag. It comes in a mid-size and a larger version, the full size. Now the mid-size is 36mm, and I think is a very interesting model, considering that one would normally associate military watches with larger watches. The larger version, however, is by no means unwieldy. It may be rather thick, at quite a thick depth considering the thickness of the bezel for extra grip, but it is only 41mm and does wear like a standard sort of dive watch with that particular stance. It also does have 20mm lugs, so it's very versatile in terms of which straps you can place on this watch. The main features of this watch, and of its smaller counterpart, are the fact that it's a fully brushed stainless steel case, which is very resilient to shocks and scratches due to this brushed finish. In addition to this, it has a highly legible military-style dial with the numerals running around the dial, as well as the 24-hour time to enable reading in the second half of the day. The hands may seem similar at first, but their lengths are clearly and easily differentiated when reading this watch. Also, the hands have these tritium tubes on them, as well as the dial, and of course tritium is an isotope of hydrogen, a beta particle emitter. But this means that it will glow without light in the first place, so it'll glow for about 20-25 years. Of course, because of this watch's nature, as historically the watch worn by United States Marine, the US Marine Corps, this watch is very tactile in terms of its surfaces. So the crown is very heavily knurled and is quite large to allow for easy grip and easy changing of the time. But equally, the bezel is also very deep and very grippy to allow for ease of use with gloves. Of course, the water resistance of this watch is 300 metres, hence the diver connotations of this watch, as this watch isn't designed really for the traditional exploration diver, but rather a military diver. Of course, you can see this in the dial and the tritium, but also the fact that this watch is water resistant to this extent, and the fact that the date has been placed at this bizarre place, I suppose, at first, at 4:30, but when we're thinking about it, it is a key place to put the date. On the basis this reduces the intrusion of the date into the design of the dial. The movement inside this watch is the Sleater SW200, so sort of a higher quality, higher end version of the ETA 2824, but of course this watch should have it easier to acquire parts, and due to the fact that Sleater are far more liberal about releasing and selling their parts than ETA. So this is certainly a very easily serviced movement at this price, and is an economical movement to service when you're paying approximately £750 to £850, depending on whether you get the mid-size or the larger model. Now this next watch is the Squale 1521, and this is a 50 atmosphere or 500 metre dive watch, which is styled like the original Squale dive watches of the 1970s. Now this brand made its name by producing cases or dive cases for Doxa and Blancpain, of course major names in the dive world community, or dive watch community. And eventually, at some point, Squale decided as a brand to make their own wristwatches, and this was the product of their endeavours. This is a very simple watch. It simply has the time and the date, with a unidirectional rotating bezel with a painted insert. However, the quality of this watch really is impressive. I have a friend who happens to own this particular watch, and he's enjoyed it since he bought it with no real problems. Now, it has a very legible handset, which is typical of the time, with those white hands and then the orange minute hand, making this watch very legible, while retaining a simplicity which was inherent in that original series of dive watches in the 1970s, where really style wasn't a major concern, it was legibility that was key. Now, the dial format is very simple and a very classic sort of dial, with a dial which is reminiscent of certain Submariners, but does follow those lines of a very classic dive watch because of how legible this original design was. Of course, the dial indices are painted on; they're not applied in that very classical style. The bezel is a simple aluminium painted insert, but at 12 o'clock it has a lume pit which is coated with a sapphire crystal to protect it from the inevitable wear of dives. The form of this case is also considered and well thought out to be very ergonomic and comfortable. So the case follows this curvature of your wrist with heavily dropped down lugs to make it altogether more comfortable. Also, the crown is recessed at 4 o'clock to make it very difficult to bump this crown on anything, and certainly does protect it very well. The date is of course placed in the regular place at 3 o'clock, but sits in a nicely beveled window which certainly does highlight the date as something to look at. Of course, several versions of this watch are available, notably the bead-blasted variants with the matte dials, and then the polished variants with the shiny or sunburst-style dials. Now, either are appealing, though I think that the more hard-wearing of the two is going to be the polished version, and this will show scratches more quickly, but they're more easily polished out, whereas the bead-blasted one, while looking supremely cool, does require professional attention if it does suffer a scratch, though I prefer the bead-blasted matte look. Of course, this watch is a 500-metre diver, so it really is a very serious dive watch, and with all the capabilities one would expect from a professional diving watch. In addition to this high water resistance, this really is Squale's major calling card, if you will. Of course, they were a case maker long before they were a watchmaker, and certainly since they were used by makers such as Blancpain and Doxa, they really were worth their salt in terms of the quality of their cases. Now, this script on the bottom half of the dial, rather, is typical of the symbols put on the original watches from Blancpain and Doxa, which had these cases, and that was so that people would know who made the case, and that it wasn't in fact the brand selling the watch, but rather a third party, in this case Squale. The movement inside this watch is an ETA 2824, which is again a workhorse of a movement and is easily serviced, but in the more recent versions I believe the movement is, despite being behind a closed caseback, heavily decorated to increase its appeal. Now, also parts for these movements should be easy to find with Squale, on the basis that the brand had a very close association with ETA in terms of friends, being friends of the brand. Therefore, parts will be available for this. Now, the pricing for this watch is around the £750 mark, though this does rise for the PVD versions, due to the added labour and cost of adding the PVD coating. Also, the polished versions are usually slightly less expensive than the bead-blasted, again due to that reduced labour cost. The next watch on this list is the Glycine Airman Double 12. And this is an interesting offering from Glycine, because it really does have the spirit and heart of the original Airman, a watch which was popularised as a GMT watch during the Vietnam War among pilots, and one which has become very central really to the Glycine DNA and identity as a brand. But here we see a watch which doesn't actually have the GMT function, but rather has a GMT or 12-hour GMT bezel. And this really does cut back on the cluttering of the original. The original has a very complex dial with a great deal of different numerals on it, whereas here we have a much simpler dial, which is easier to get your mind around if you're new to GMT watches. Of course, apart from this change, the watch remains very much true to the original. So it has a bidirectional rotating bezel, with that second crown at just shy of 4 o'clock, which is used to secure the bezel in place when it's set to a particular position. It also has a very heavily loomed dial, and with a great deal of loom on the indices, and then even more on the hands. Now, the second hand isn't loomed simply because it isn't really necessary in the cockpit, in the same way that the hours and the minutes are, so therefore it wasn't loomed to reduce the interference it would cause. The date is placed at 3 o'clock, and is very legible and certainly melds into the dial very nicely. Now, the bezel of this watch is interesting. It's a brushed stainless steel bezel with these inset and painted numerals around it. So it isn't loomed, but it certainly does meld into the dial very nicely due to this uniform look. Now, the general design of this watch is very distinctive. The design of the case is typical of this particular watch due to those jutting out lugs, but still lugs which retain a great deal of strength and clear rigidity. Now, the top of the case is brushed, including the bezel, but the sides of the case and the crown, or the crowns rather, are polished to give a difference in finish and also to break up the thickness of this watch. And this is quite a thick watch, but nonetheless is very wearable with a nice leather strap. Now, there are several versions of this watch, notably a black dial version, which is the most true to the original, and there is also a red and blue dégradé style dial. And there is also a green one as well, though the blue and the red are the more easy to find. And these two have these dials where at the top they're nearly black, and then reach the true saturation of their colour or hue at the very bottom of the dial. And this makes them resemble a sort of a sky. The blue one reminds me of a night sky going from the light of towns, if you will, on the bottom, through to the darkness of the sky. And the red one is rather, in my mind, more of a morbid reference to the Vietnam War, with the fires that you would see burning during the night and the darkness of night at the top of the dial. Nonetheless, all of these watches are very poignant in their colouring and their design, making them very clear and legible, while also having a touch of drama to them, which I think is very well placed. Now, the price for this 40mm watch is just under £1,000 in some places, and also you can get them for just shy of £900 in others. So the price does fluctuate, but generally these are very well priced watches considering the history and the features they offer. The penultimate watch on this list is a wonderful creation from Hanhart, the Pioneer Preventer 9. Now, this follows on from the Pioneer lineup of pilot's watches, and does give a modern take, I suppose, on the classical Hanhart pilot's watch. And this watch, despite not being a chronograph, and of course Hanhart being known for their chronographs, is an interesting consideration and one which is beautifully executed by Hanhart themselves. The dial is either black or this off-white cream colour, which is also very elegant, with these contrast-painted loomed numerals around the dial, which have a very 1930s aesthetic. In addition to these, the dial also features an offset small seconds, which is placed at the 9 o'clock position, and this removes the clutter that could be placed at 6 o'clock if it was placed there, but nonetheless moves the second hand away from the centre of the dial, and makes those cathedral hands altogether more legible. These cathedral hands are also very heavily loomed, as are the numerals around the dial. The design of this watch, as is ever the case with Hanhart, is exemplary, and the finishing is similarly beautiful. Now, the whole case is sort of beveled in order to produce a wonderful design which tapers towards the edge of the lugs, and certainly does make the head of the watch look larger in relation to the strap, despite still being a very comfortable size. The case is fully brushed to make it altogether more uniform in its look, but also to retain a certain military vibe, which was always the case with the original as a clear pilot's watch. The bezel, unlike the various other ones produced by Hanhart, is not a rotatable one, but is this inset and concave style, which I think draws the eye to the centre of the dial and to the beautiful finishing there. Of course, this watch comes on either the customary, beautifully finished Hanhart strap, which has that wonderful rivet in the centre to hark back to the days of early pilot's watches from the 1930s, or an advanced bracelet which has an interesting finish and certainly isn't like any other bracelet on the market. Although that said, I would always incline towards the leather strap simply because I think it suits the watch better in this particular design. Inside this watch is a very heavily modified ETA, and this has been modified as such to move the second hand from the central position to 9 o'clock, which is no mean feat really, and does show Hanhart's real superior watchmaking. Also, it's worthy to point out the fact that these watches are only made by two people working for Hanhart. They have two watchmakers, or as far as I know, they only have two watchmakers. I mean, these watches are certainly quite rare, and you likely won't see another one in the wild. Now, the price for this watch, made by the company that made the first affordable stopwatch, is £900 or so, which I think is an exceptional deal for a watch with such pedigree and a certain watchmaking charm, and also a very classical vibe, which is rare to see and certainly does hark back to the original watches made by Hanhart in that era. This final watch is the Longines Heritage Military COSD. This is an interesting re-edition of a watch made by Longines in the 1940s, which was given to British soldiers, including the paratroopers. And this is a very interesting watch because it really does hark back to the original and remains very true to the original. The dial has those numerals going around the edge of the dial, and that railway style second track, which makes it very legible but very typical of the era. The crown is very large but quite flat, and therefore is comfortable and doesn't dig into the wrist, but is still very easily used for setting the time. Now, this isn't a screw-down crown, and the water resistance of this watch is only 30 metres, but really for the purposes of this watch it wasn't really needed to be a water-resistant piece, only splash-proof. Around the inside of the dial in red, we see these 24-hour numerals to allow one to read the second half of the day, as is the case with the Airman. The date is also at 3 o'clock, which is the real departure from the original, where the original had no date, but I think Longines felt that for a modern watch the date really was necessary. Lume is placed around the dial and is arranged in small pips with lines at the four sections of the dial. The only difference is that at 12 o'clock there are 2 pips as well to enable the quick legibility of 12 o'clock. The hands are also lumed and are blued beautifully via heat treatment to give this very old-fashioned look, which was of course used to make hands more contrasting on the dial colour. In order to adhere to the original design, this watch is fully polished to give a uniformly shiny look, including that large and quite thick bezel. Of course, watches back then, especially military watches, had the cheapest possible finish, so of course in that era, polishing was the clear answer to this. Also, any scratches could be polished out, which was a nice feature and increased the longevity of these watches. This watch is also available with a black dial, and in this case the hands are no longer blued, but otherwise the watch remains very, very similar. Of course, the fact they're not blued is a question of legibility, and of course shiny polished hands are far more legible on a black background. Now the case shape is quite interesting. It has a very simple rounded shape to the case, apart from the lugs which drop down quite substantially, but are quite long too, and this allows for NATO straps and other pass-through straps to be worn very easily on this watch. It is also sold with a NATO strap, which is a green military-style NATO strap, which certainly is a nice touch, and is an interesting one which does bring military divisions to mind. My only complaint with this is the fact that the strap, or rather the NATO strap, hadn't been invented in the 1940s, but was a creation of the 60s, so it's not quite accurate there, but nonetheless, I applaud Longines for selling it with a strap which is true to the military form. One interesting detail on the dial is that broad arrow just beneath the Longines script, and that is symbolic of of British military property. And all British military watches have this symbol on them to denote where they're from and their respective owner. So this is rather an interesting touch to place on the dial. Now, usually this would be placed on the case back, but I do appreciate the fact that Longines have placed it on the dial to further emphasise its history and its roots. The movement of this watch is a simple ETA 2824, and that has been a recurring theme in this video. I do apologise, but it certainly does show that this is the workhorse of the area in this price bracket, and certainly is an easily serviced and practical movement. But at least in Longines' specification, it certainly is very well made and nicely decorated too, though sadly one can't see it through the closed case back of this watch. The price for this watch comes at just shy of £1,000 from most sources, though one can find it for a little bit more if one doesn't search a great deal. Anyway, that concludes this video. So thank you very much for watching. Do please like, share and subscribe if you did enjoy this video, and please do leave your comments down below as to other watches you think might have made the list. So thank you very much for watching. This is I'm the Watch Guy, over and out.